So New York is cursed or gifted with a European insect that attacks only alfalfa. It has been there for 100 years. It came in on sailing boat ballast, and the entire North American infestation is 9 counties in New York. It's called alfalfa snout beetle. It's Odorhynchus linguisticae, native to Europe, probably brought in from England. We know that it was introduced between 1845 and 1893 because there's one that's pinned in the National Museum dated 1893, Oswego, New York. 1845 because that's the first time the Canadians dug a canal around the Lucina Rapids, and that's the first time an ocean-going vessel could go from the Atlantic Ocean into Lake Ontario. 1845.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're back with another episode. We're going to talk about agriculture. We're going to talk about pest protection. We've got Professor Elson Shields. How you doing, sir?
Good, very good.
He is, down there at the Cornell University. It was there for you. How long were you at Cornell?
I was at Cornell for 36 years. I retired on September 1st of 2022.
Oh, wow. So just recently. Okay. And you studied mainly entomopathogenic nematodes. Is that right?
My responsibilities at Cornell were to study the insects of field crops, which included foliar and soil insects. And so I've focused a lot on soil insects. And one of the natural enemies of soil insects are entomopathogenic nematodes.
Interesting.
And so the last 20 years, we focused on entomopathogenic nematodes, and more importantly, figuring out why the native nematodes are able to persist for years, and the commercial ones die off in less than 30 days.
Uh-huh.
So the same species that you buy on the internet will only last in your garden 7 to 30 days. The wild species, the wild strains of the exact species will persist in your garden forever. And why is that?
Yeah, why is that?
It is because in the commercial production, they have lost the genes to allow them to persist. And whether they did this intentionally so they could sell you the nematodes every time you needed them, or whether they did it by accident, not understanding the system is up for debate. And in working with a scientist, I think it's the latter. They didn't understand and they lost it, and they haven't asked the right questions to go rediscover it.
Yeah. And we got caught up in industrialized farming for so long. Have you seen a move back towards organic gardening and using nematodes as time goes on?
Well, my focus has always been commercial ag.
Interesting.
And, because New York State is the 3rd largest milk producer in the United States. And if you have that many dairy cows, you have to have a reliable, high quality food source for the ruminant. And alfalfa and corn play critical roles. And the only way that you can produce those economically is large scale commercial agriculture.
Interesting.
And so that's been the primary focus. As I worked up the data and showed through research that you only have to initially inoculate your field one time with persistent EPNs, I have quite a number of organic growers who have inoculated their farms in New York State. Because the second soil insect that is the curse of the organic farmer is wireworms.
Okay.
And these are also very effective on wireworms.
Interesting. And have you ever felt any pushback since you mentioned before when we started talking that you're the snake oil salesman, but the snake oil you have actually works. What are some of the other things that you've seen come along that is in commercial ag that is legitimate snake oil that you wonder why don't they just use nematodes?
I really can't answer that question. I mean, I've kind of had blinders on trying to solve my problem. I think that there are so many of the biological organisms that are sold in agriculture that if there are improvements, it's only incremental. And it's very hard to document. It's so much variability in agriculture. You can have the most perfect set of experiments, and then you don't get rain, for instance, and the whole thing goes down the tube. And so it's really hard to demonstrate some of the more minor advantages that you might get from some of the biologicals. The other is soil is a very complex place, and where it may work in one area, one pH, it may not work in another. And so, I mean, that's what the farmers deal with all the time.
Yeah.
And that is also a barrier for what we do. This sounds like the concept, and we're working primarily in corn. Corn rootworm is resistant, becoming resistant to GMOs. And so the farmers are having to deal with rootworm damage, even though they're planting genetically modified crops, which used to work. And so what we are found, we go in and demonstrate that if they treat half a field, we can recover anywhere between 6 and 15 bushels to the acre. And that's the best sales tool, is to say, okay, here's nematodes at a reduced cost or free. And, you'll love this idea and you'll hate this idea, because you'll love it because you think you're getting something free, and then you'll hate me at harvest because you realize how much you actually lose. And that's the greatest sales tool that we have found. And most of your other products that fall under the category of snake oil, the people are unwilling to do that. So we're pretty confident in our impact, because I've been working with this for 36 years.
Yeah, you've been working for this for a long time, and begs the question: how did you get into it initially? What led you to study something that we can't even really see?
That's the first time an ocean-going vessel could go from the Atlantic Ocean into Lake Ontario, 1845. So we have that window. It was not a problem until we introduced alfalfa in the 1920s, and it's called alfalfa snout beetle, and it kills out alfalfa in a single year. It cannot be controlled by any conventional pesticide. As a new faculty member in 1986, the dean called me in and said, "Elson, I have a project for you." And being a smug assistant professor, I said, "Okay, great. I'll solve it in 5 years." Well, it took me 25 years. And luckily, the dean didn't die on me. I was able to finally report that I had it solved. Well, in the process of trying to figure out, one of my graduate students, a postdoc, actually suggested entomopathogenic nematodes. And I said to him, "No, I'm not interested, because they do not persist. It's a low value crop. The only way I would be interested is if we could go back and understand why the wild strains, which are there for millions of years, whether we could get them to work." And he called me some not so positive names and stomped out. And this was 1992. And he actually went out and isolated the strains that we found ultimately used today. He isolated them in New York. And then we proceeded to figure out why they persist, why commercial ones don't, how we can change rearing, how we can move toward mass production. And the farmers of New York were very helpful, because there were some risk takers. And they would say, "Okay, I can give you the money that it costs to rear them. We can put them out in a field." And that gave me a vastly expanded laboratory, because we could figure out how to apply them. We could figure out all of that. Fast forward to 2020, and the farmers have found that a single application controls alfalfa snout beetle. And there's more than 50,000 acres in upstate New York that have been treated. And alfalfa life has gone from 1 year back up to 6 years, because snout beetle is being controlled by the single application of these wild nematodes. In the course of that study, the farmers asked the question, will they survive across rotation? And I said, well, I don't know. We'll look. And so we put out a trial for 10 years across 75 fields that And sure, they persist across the corn alfalfa rotation. And then we found in that study they have activity against corn rootworm. Well, corn rootworm is a major problem in the Midwest. So then that expanded the study to corn rootworm. We controlled it in trials for 9 years. And then the question was asked, okay, that's New York strain, that's New York, how will they persist across the country? So some of my colleagues put them out in hostile environments like Roswell, New Mexico, in corn, irrigated corn, and they persist fine all the way across the United States.
Wow. Wow.
So that allowed us to generate data. We have data on persistence and efficacy in Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Nebraska, all the way to the high plains of Texas and southeast New Mexico. So that's into that corn market, as I referred to, previous. So that's kind of how we got here.
Wow. And so these little guys propagate themselves to a certain degree. Is that right?
They completely propagate themselves. What we are doing, so back up to the commercial ones, when you use the ones off the internet that are commercial, you are applying them at a very high rate, 1 billion to the acre, because it's a biopesticide. You are not expecting them, because they don't persist, to actually become a permanent part of the soil. Ours, we inoculate an acre with only 50 million. And the idea is an inoculation. And they find and reproduce in the insects that are there, and then they have the genes to persist, and then so they can hang out for a couple of years until the next insects come along. And so this is how we get multi-year pest control out of them, pest management. And
like you said, this is a horrible investment for investors out there who want to put their money down on something. This is something that you put it in once and it's there forever.
Well, yeah. I mean, my son has spun off a startup company against my best advice. That's what sons do. They think the old man doesn't know anything. And then I was informed on retirement. I'm now part of his business. And I told him it's a horrible business model because you're selling to a farmer only once. In reality, a farmer will not inoculate his whole farm in 1 year. It'll be over 3 or 4 years. So a field may only get inoculated once, but a farmer will be a repeat customer for 3 or 4 years. So it's not quite as a horrible business model as I laid out to be. But the best way to convince farmers is to give them a cut rate for half a field, and then they can see for themselves how much yield they recover. Uh-huh. And this is where the love-hate comes in. They love the idea, but then they hate me at harvest because they understand exactly how much they've been losing.
Yeah. So you worked in commercial ag, and this is a different kind of thing, but do you rub elbows with the organic hippie crowd? Do you ever pick up ideas from them or have any respect for what they do?
Well, I think there's a niche for them. I appreciate what they do. The hippie crowd, come on, I'm 71. I graduated from high school in 1969.
Oh, really?
That's my crowd. Cool. Be careful.
No, that's actually my crowd. Look at my banjo back there. Come on, I'm all about peace and love and organic vegetables. So
there are. So first of all, we can't feed the world on organic. Okay. It's a niche. You can run through the numbers, and there isn't. It doesn't work number wise. There are, but if people want to, go that way, I mean, we could do a whole podcast on why I don't think it's feasible. But anyway, I think that persistent pathogenic. See, I stuttered when I was a kid. That's why I call them biocontrol nematodes. Entomopathogenic. There's a niche for them, in their operation. So I talked to them, and when I was at Cornell, we worked with them a little bit. Yeah. But the problem is, once you try and start working with commercial ag, their operations are so small that you really can't afford to deliver persistent nematodes, because we operate in minimum of 100 acres, 100 to 1,000 acres with our formulation. And the opposite is true. The current commercial suppliers that have the cute little packages that you buy on the internet, if a farmer wanted to say, hey, I want to treat 140 acres, they'd be opening lots of packages, and their packaging doesn't work in big agriculture.
So are you going to be able to scale up to a degree where you can suit everybody's need, the biggest boys in town?
My son thinks so.
And he's going to make you work until the very end.
Well, like I said offline, I told him that I'm happy to work with him between retirement and senility, and I think that's going to be about 30 days.
Yeah. We'll see.
So we were able to scale up and do 7,000 acres last year.
Wow.
We learned a lot. The target is 15,000 acres this year. So it's a challenge to get the farmers to want it. It's a challenge that you have to scale up the whole supply chain issues, facilities. At some point, you have to generate enough money that you can make the big jump into actually paying people rather than a senile old man that's supposed to do all the work.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. The number one son has not given up his day job, so he's trying to, it's a startup. Everybody's scrambling.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I think, like, you probably noticed that there's going to be a need in the future, and that this method is good. This is why I called you, because I thought I got friends and colleagues who tell me the same thing. This is the future is reverting back to a primitive kind of way of thinking about our soils and stuff like this.
Well, the farmers and a lot of non-agriculture people don't understand this. The farmers are our best conservationists that there are. I mean, sure, they have to make a living, and the idle person that goes by may not think this, but it's a lot of it's all about education. So, 20 years ago, farmers fall plowed, across the United States. You would drive across the United States and you would see dirt in the snowdrifts. Now we have progressed that the guy who fall plows gets pressure from his neighbors because it's a bad habit. He's not saving his soil. So we have a huge adoption of cover crops. We have a huge adoption of minimum till, sometimes no till. You drive around in western Kansas, western Nebraska, eastern Colorado, which is close to where I now live, and you don't see the blowing dirt that you used to see. So farmers have evolved. A lot of it, and this is the role of extension, interfaced, and the ag colleges, extension, and the farmers to figure it out, how to make it more work, or how to make it all work, and to reduce the environmental impact of agriculture.
Yeah.
And that's what I've said all along. That's my goal, to reduce the environmental impact of agriculture.
Yeah.
And people have to realize that agriculture is disrupting the environment. I mean, the minute that we decide we need to live and raise food, the environment is disrupted. Stop and think about that for a minute.
Yeah, this is heavy. This is like, we're talking an agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago. Everything really changed.
It really changed. So if you want to get mad at the farmer, you got to give up eating. and that's kind of a snippy comment, but if you really stop and think about it, you can take you're currently in Germany. You can go to the plains of Ukraine, the agricultural regions of Ukraine, or Hungary, where I've spent some time. That used to be steep. That used to be prairie. It's now agriculture. Well, that's a pretty severe disruption. Where are all the prairie animals? The wild horses that used to be running across Ukraine? They're not there. The same with our Midwest. It used to be prairie. Well, it didn't support very many people. So
Sure.
The minute that you come and have a population that expects to be fed, imagine that, and you bring in agriculture, you disrupt the environment. So really the goal is, how do you minimize that disruption of the environment.
So you're basically saying that we've got our population up to a degree because of industrialized agriculture, that the whole thing is kind of built on this wobbly popsicle stand, and we need to figure out a way to address that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a chicken and an egg, right? The stability of the United States is basically because we have a stable food source. That is the basis. The reason I got to spend my life in academics, being paid to think, was because only less than 10% of the population feed the United States. 100 years ago, both my parents came off the farm in World War II.
Yeah.
You're right. My dad had a PhD career. He got to go to college, but it was all because agriculture became much more efficient. I think the figure at 1900 was, at the year 1900, was 80% of the population in the United States were on farms in 1900.
Agrarian.
By the year 2000, the actual farmers were down to less than 10%.
Wow. Wowee.
What is the cause and effect? You got more production, people could leave. We could fuel all of the improvements of society, engineering, all of those sorts of things, which got back to the farm, and what have you. So it's really a hand-in-hand thing. So you start pointing your finger, it doesn't leave you many options. You either have to continue to figure out how to produce more and more food, reduce the environmental impact, or have a bunch of people starve.
Yeah. Or a little bit of all three. We'll see. Yeah. Well, I hope that nobody, has to starve to death. But there's also the issue of food usage and food distribution being unequal in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
But I'm happy when guys like you come along and try to sift through the past and then try to change some of the problems that we've created for ourselves with technology and just being too advanced, in a sense.
Well, let's take electric. We're kind of off the topic, but while we're being a philosophy,
please.
think about electric tractors. Like getting the farmer away from diesel.
Yeah.
The most of the farmers go, electric tractors have no place on the farm. And they just reject the idea. The innovative farmers, and I enjoy talking to these, they go like, you know what? We'll figure it out. The operating costs are 1/4. We add weight to diesel tractors so they can have traction. That automatically comes with all the batteries. You have 4 electric motors. You have simplicity. If we only get 5 hours of work out of it before recharge, we'll figure that out. Yeah. That's the innovative farmer. And that's the same one that looks at, I had one farmer in eastern Colorado, the Hoxton, Colorado. And he listened to my presentation and he wrote me a check for $47,000 and treated 1,000 acres of his corn.
Holy smokes.
Based on my data. And I sat down and talked with him and he said, well, I'm a risk taker. And he goes, frankly, that's chump change in my operation. So that's a lot of money for you and me, but the amount of money that flows through an operation, he said, I would have spent that amount on soil insecticide.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the innovative farmer. That's the one that'll figure out how to do electric tractors. That's the one that's always on the leading edge. Does he get it right all the time? He will admit that he doesn't. So it's an interesting dynamic working with commercial ag. And then you've got the group of farmers that, death is going to have to part you, and hopefully the next generation will be more innovative because they're so stuck in their ways.
Yeah. Innovative. It takes a special kind of person to notice a problem and then want to take the risk to go around it. So most of them just do what they're told to do. And but yeah, as an organic kind of hippie myself, it's just really comforting to know that even the big boys who are out there trying to just got the profit motive underneath them, still are going to try to do the efficient, more reasonable thing. Because this is not just better for the environment. This is highly efficient.
Oh, that's right. That's right. But, one of the other things you could do offline if you're really interested is take the most productive organic farm and figure out how many people it feeds, and take the equal acreage of a commercial farm and figure out how many people it feeds. And you'll find that there are, and I've not done this, I'm just speculating.
Yeah.
But I'll bet you it's order of magnitude or two.
Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah. Seems right. But
so anyway, we got a little bit off the topic.
Well, it's good. It's good to have you on and talk about nematodes. I want to ask you one more thing. As far as using it, is there a way to use it too much? Are there detrimental side effects to using nematodes? Are there anything that anybody's supposed to be looking out for that would turn them away from this thing?
Okay, so the 3 species of nematodes that we isolated in northern New York are found across the United States. But they are not, you usually only find one of the species. Let's say you in a field in Nebraska. You sample a field in Nebraska, you'll find only one of the species. What we have discovered is you need to mix the species together so you have a total, you have much better control based on the segmentation of the soil profile. So what we're really doing is taking a New York isolation, but it's the same species as what's in Nebraska. And there's no EPA regulations, that says we can't do it because it's found across. I mean, we can take the New York species and import them into Canada without special permits because they're found in Canada, right? So it's a ubiquitous species. But in nature, because it's only one species, you never seem to get very good pest control out of it. We come along and inoculate with a sufficient number of both species, it becomes established in this artificial environment called agriculture. So that's basically what we do. And so part of our knowledge is what species mix based on soil type. And so you inoculate. They do not attack anything but insects. And there are research papers that show that they don't attack beneficial insects. Beneficial insects like rabbit beetles actually have their immune system is revved up to where they repel nematodes. Nematodes will reproduce in them if they're dead, but not if they're alive, which says that there's an immune system, defense.
Wow. Now,
are all soil insects susceptible to entomopathogenic nematodes? No. Some of and one of the examples we talk about is another European insect that's been introduced to the United States, European chafer, which is a white grub, June beetle white grub. And it actually evolved in the presence of nematodes, and it actually has a sieve plate over its breathing openings with the openings that are too small for the nematodes to get in. So it was a coevolutionary arms race, to where, and they're really immune to nematodes. So if they're in your yard and you try and use nematodes, it's like a complete failure. So you get this coevolution, and so certain groups of insects are not sensitive to entomopathogenic nematodes. Wow. So that goes on. So many of our agricultural pests are. Corn rootworm is, black vine weevil, strawberry root weevil, those odorhynchus weevils are very sensitive. Native white grubs, which are native to the United States, are very sensitive, and wireworms. So those are main agricultural pests, and there's probably some others.
So the beneficial insects are completely all right. Stuff like ladybugs, butterflies, they're all right.
They're fine, yeah.
Wow.
Well, first of all, butterflies, are not, the lepidopteran that are agricultural pests are all the ugly moths. The
Right.
butterflies you see flying around do not tend to be a problem in agriculture.
Ah, okay. What about the moths, like corn moths or the little white ones that are flying around?
Well, if the larvae, well, first of all, they're a problem insect. You want to control them. So if you lose a few to nematodes, no big deal.
I hate them so much.
But if it's all about soil interface. So some life stage has to be in the soil for EPNs to attack them.
Okay.
So if you take the various cutworms, black cutworm, spotted cutworm, sandhill cutworm, those larvae tend to be in the soil, interfaced with the soil. If it's dry, they tend to be subterranean. They are very susceptible and get nailed by EPNs.
Hmm.
If you're talking about something like European corn borer, which is in the corn stalk, in the stalk of the corn, EPNs won't get to them. So there's a separation, so it's not a viable, management strategy for European corn borer. So you have to understand the system, and it's how big, the greater the soil interface of the insect, usually the more susceptible they are to EPNs.
Interesting. And what about excreting waste? How do these little guys, these nematodes, how do they excrete waste?
Okay, so we got to back up for life cycle, which is you asked me earlier, and we got off on this jag about. I completely blew off that question.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, we cycled back. So the life stage of the EPN that's in the soil is called the infective juvenile. The infective juvenile, it's free living in the soil. It does not feed. Its whole role in life is to use its fat reserves and to find an insect. Once it finds an insect, it penetrates usually through the spherical openings. And once it gets inside, it molts. It releases a bacteria that it carries with it, symbiotic bacteria, which multiplies and actually kills the insect. It's the bacteria that actually kills the insect. And it's unique to each species.
Wow.
Now, this bacteria creates a septicemia, and it actually dissolves the innards of the insect. Because nematodes don't have teeth, right? And so they just lay in this nutrient soup inside this skin called the insect, which we call a cadaver, and they soak up the nutrients, and they form sexual adults, and the sexual adults create more offspring, and they may run 1 or 2 or 3 life cycles in the insect depending upon how many nutrient reserves are in there. Wow. And once they've used up all the nutrients in that cadaver, which is preserved by antibiotics by the bacteria that they carry with them, once everything, they burst out.
Ooh.
So one average size insect larvae, will produce 100,000 infective juveniles.
Wow.
These infective juveniles now burst out into the soil. They distribute by swimming on the water film on soil particles. That's how they distribute. And they find their next insect by the CO2 gradient of the insect breathing underground. One of the defenses some of the insects have is they hold their breath for an hour and they only take a breath once an hour. So now you disrupt the CO2 gradient, so they puff, right? We know way too much about this. Now, so that's the life cycle. Okay, now you take a commercial strain. Every one of those 100,000 IJs that burst out of recycling is immediately infected, right? There 100,000 of them are looking for the next prey. If they don't find it, they become exhausted and they die. This is why they last only 7 to 30 days. With the wild strains, only about 40% are immediately infected. 60% of those 100,000 are going like, okay, I'm just going to hang out for some extended period of time. We don't quite know what the extended period of time is, but we have soil samples that have been at lab temperatures for 3 years.
What?
3 years at lab temperatures, that have just had these infective juveniles, and we throw in insects and they still die.
Wow.
So there's a portion of the population of these persistent genes that are still hanging out after 3 years of lab temperatures. And they're just on the bench. We're not babying them at all. Now you think about agriculture in the temperate climates, we have winter, right? 6 months out of the year, you are below soil temperatures of anything moving around. So they're not exhausting. They're not burning fat reserves. So theoretically, maybe they can hang out for 6 years without finding a host. That's persistent, right? The other thing is we find that we don't get 100% activity with these wild strains until the second growing season. And it's partly because of what I just explained to you. You know, 40% are immediately infective, 60% have this phased in activity. Well, the 40% that find a host then kick out the same 40% active and 60% that are hanging out. And so you recycle about 3 times. Now you have a whole array of nematodes in your soil that are hanging out, right, for some future time. So that's why we see in the second growing season, we see our maximum activity.
Wow. Wow. So,
and that trait has been lost in commercial ag, with commercial nematodes.
And we still don't, they're coddled. They're a bit too coddled, and they just don't have the strength.
Well, no, what happens is when you commercially produce them, you harvest let's say you go to get wild nematodes. And we know this because we've accidentally done this. I hate to admit this, but you go get the wild nematodes. And so I said 40% are immediately active. So you pull those off and you generate the next generation, and you pull off the 40% immediately active. And pretty soon you lose the genes of the persistent ones because you're only harvesting and propagating the ones that are immediately active. And you do that in about 6 or 8 generations, and you have a strain that doesn't persist. And so it's pretty quickly lost. So we have had to develop a completely new way, which I'm not going to explain to you, to actually.
It's a secret.
It's a secret. It's a trade secret.
That's okay. We wouldn't want to know. The people out there, they're hardly hanging on if they're watching.
Well, whatever. I mean, it's the whole understanding about, and we go back to nature. We re-isolate in nature, on a frequent basis. Yeah. We let Mother Nature maintain the persistence, and we've figured out how to maintain it for a relatively short geological time. And then we always go back and re-isolate.
And this is why I have a lot of respect for you, invited you, because I know that you're not just forcing Mother Nature, but you're just encouraging Mother Nature to do her thing, because the systems work so well.
We're partnering with Mother Nature.
Partner. It's a give and take. Yeah. Well, we'll have you on again. We'll cut it now. We're going to check in with you again. Everybody out there who's looking for some help on their farm, contact Elson Shields. He knows his stuff, and maybe he can help you come up with some, strategies on how to.
Well, there is a web page.
Well, tell them about it.
Okay, so the spin-off company that my poor son dementedly created, and I have been enslaved to. No, I'm just joking. It's called Persistent Biocontrol. And there's a web page, and in a day or two, there will be an upgraded web page. And there's a contact through that if people are interested for more information or that sort of thing.
Yeah, and there'll be a link to your website down in the description below for everybody who's going to watch. Yeah, that's about it. Anything else? Well,
the other thing is, I don't know when your podcast goes live, but on February 22nd, I'm giving a Zoominar, which I could also send you the link to.
Yeah.
Hosted by Kansas State University. It's going to be focused on commercial ag and the data in corn, but it gives you a fuller picture of the research that's behind it. They limited me to 30 minutes. I could talk several hours, but it's going to be the most appropriate.
Well, this will go live over the weekend if we can include that too, and then we'll get people your direction.
Okay,
we can do it. All right. Well, we'll sign off. We'll talk after this. We'll wave goodbye to everybody. Thanks for it. This is Elson Shields, Cornell University Nematode Master. Bye.
Thank you.